Recently, the Society for Vascular Surgery decided to create an archive of audio-video tapes of those who have contributed to vascular surgery, particularly the pioneers of vascular surgery. Under the aegis of Dr. Jimmy Yao as our chairman, we have a historical video committee, and our job is to interview those who contributed for many years. It's my honor, Norman M. Rich, today to interview the legendary Allan Callow of Boston, but here in San Francisco today. We were talking earlier about one meeting that I remembered here in San Francisco in 1968 when Dr. Callow was just promoted to Rear Admiral in the Navy Reserve, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But Dr. Callow, we're very honored that you would consent to this interview, and what we would like to do, following somewhat a standardized format, is just ask you to tell us a little bit about your beginning, your youth, your family.
Well, I'm first of all very grateful. I'm honored because there are so many people we both know who, I think at least, deserve this far more than I do. I think it is a great honor, and it's a great energizing episode at a time of life when one can appreciate these things. I have one hesitation about my praise, and that is that it's an odd experience and a first for me to think of myself as an archive. I think it's delightful. Once again, I have to come back to the fact that after many years in this merry-go-round of vascular surgery and so forth, there are so many others that I would have chosen.
But let's put it another way and say you are one of the most experienced vascular surgeons.
Okay.
You won't argue with that.
Thank
so
you.
Please do tell us a little bit about growing up. So much of your life was in the state of Massachusetts, and particularly in Boston. Take us back to that.
I had a great time. I cannot understand. It's very difficult for me to understand the unrest, the hostility of some young people today, whether it's here or in some other country. My boyhood was absolutely wonderful. If you wanted something, a bicycle, say, okay, my father would say, go get it, and you go out and sell a few papers or whatever, and get a little cash together. You could have almost anything you wanted, and you felt really that everything was in reach. Somehow, without having been told, I knew I was going to go to college. I knew I was going to go to medical school. And I also knew that although I couldn't be precise, that I would have support, mostly moral.
Had both of your parents been college graduates?
No, I was the first. My family came to this country first in 1628, and we're farmers, fishermen, carpenters, and so forth. They settled up in a little tiny island in northern Maine in 1528. And I suspect that for a few glass-colored beads and a bottle or two of rum, they acquired some land up there, and they formed a little shipping company. And that company went out of business because the railroads came along, and they had worked for the railroads too. And the railroads went out of business when the interstates and the highways were built. But it was always a happy family, and I feel very fortunate to have been supported.
We know that you received a Bachelor of Science degree at Tufts University in 1938. Did you have somebody who provided mentorship for you?
Oh, yes. I've been thinking about mentors, and almost every step of the way. High school was a French teacher, and she taught us integrity. In college, there was a botany professor. I was supposed to be a PhD student, and he was a geneticist, and raised a tomato that was so many would fit in this number 10 can, and the Burpee Seed Company would have provided the funding for the PhD. In medical school was just a plethora of mentoring people, absolutely fantastic.
Being that you were at Tufts, was there someone who encouraged you to apply to Harvard and go to Harvard Medical School?
No. When I asked my professor, my mentor, my tomato hero, so to speak, he refused to do it. He said, "You're not going to be, the world doesn't need another doctor, for heaven's sakes. We need a plant geneticist to feed the world." And it got so tense that he would cross the campus to avoid passing me on one of the walkways. But he finally wrote me a very fine letter.
Good.
And the ironic thing about this, Norm, is so often the case. He has been my mentor, my hero, and so forth. And he retired to a little town in Maine and died of a ruptured aortic aneurysm.
Oh, goodness.
And I was at that time doing that kind of surgery. Sad.
Yeah. When you went to Harvard, did you meet any surgeons during your 4 years of medical school? Were there mentors there?
Oh, yes. Elliot Cutler. He was my hero at medical school. And he would come in at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning into this Greek-style amphitheater in white sneakers, tennis sneakers, powder blue scrub suit, Russian pajama, two-button neck and collar. The doors would fling open. His Batman from World War I would precede him, throw open these swing doors, and Elliot would come right in. "Sorry, gentlemen, I'm very sorry. I had to go down to Washington. I had a little trouble. Franklin had a little trouble. He needed me, but we'll go ahead." And there was air raid warnings going on now and then, and I was operating with them. This was at the former Peterbilt Brigham Hospital. The sirens were going, and he put his hands on our hands on top of the draped patient. He said, "Don't panic. Don't get under the table. Stay upright. We have to take care of this patient." There was nothing but a horn going. But he was a very good surgeon and a very caring man, and it interested me that he was another example of someone coming from an humble background, rural Maine, Bangor, Maine, and his family had very little help for him. But he rose to the top of his profession.
Yeah. Well, he certainly had a colorful career in World War II, didn't he?
Didn't he?
Yeah.
Yes, he did.
You know, you graduated in 1942, and World War II had just started. You had to have an internship before you could go on active duty.
Yes.
Tell us about that, please.
Well, I went to Harvard Medical School, and I think it is one of the finest institutions, not just of its kind, but of the institutional culture. And we had a meeting the first day with the dean, and he said, "Gentlemen, welcome. You're going to have a wonderful time here. You're not going to flunk out. This is not the law school. You'll be here next year unless you choose not to be." That was the attitude. He said, "You will have fun here. You will learn things, and you will work very hard, and you will find that working hard is fun." And then he had a meeting about a week later and said, "You are a very special generation. You survived a depression, which was severe. And now you are probably going to survive a war. We are convinced there will be a war within the next 2 or 3 years. Now let me tell you, right now, we believe this school supports the government. And you are, as long as you're here, you will support the government. And the first thing you do, you go out and get a reserve commission. I don't care if it's the Army, the Navy, the Dog Catchers Association. Because if you are drafted, we aren't going to lift a finger to help you. But if you, and medical school was I was about to say it was a romp. And it was in a way. It was just terribly hard, a lot of work. But you knew that you were going to survive it. You knew you weren't going to fuck out.
Right. Where did you do your internship?
I stayed right in Boston. And it was interesting. I had trained as a student for quite some time at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Wonderful institution, absolutely. And in a different way, culturally and scientifically. Also at the Peterbent Brigham. I loved the Brigham. It was a family cottage almost hospital, but very, very friendly. Fiercely competitive.
Right.
But all of the things that I seemed to get involved in were fiercely competitive. So I did it at the city because I was told that I would have more hands-on contact with patients, and it turned out to be the case.
Did you have a hero among the surgeons at that time?
Yes, I did. He never rose to the prominence in the pantheon that others did because he was quickly called. His name was Robert Cochran. He was called to active duty very soon, and he headed up the unit that went overseas.
When you were called up, were you in the reserve at that time? Did I understand
Well,
that
it's a
correct?
strange thing. I don't know what had happened to me. It was an epiphany of some sort, I guess. But I looked at my papers of some little time ago, and I was first appointed. They had to create, they needed a junior position that it wasn't junior enough for me. And I was appointed a voluntary, probationary ensign in the volunteer medical department, whatever, of the Navy, whatever that was. And that was in 1939. So when 1941 came along, you know, I automatically,
Right.
I was promoted several grades from voluntary ensign to, you know, JG and so forth. But I had to go to the Navy because our forebears, my forebears, came over here. One was a captain, ship captain. In Maine, they were building ships. When the King's men came through Scotland, where much of my family was, they burned your cottage, took your cattle, and sold your women, I suppose. And so my family was living up there, and the name was McCullough, M-A-C, and an O-U-G-H instead of O-W. So they dropped all those things and fled to Liverpool, then fled to the Isle of Man. And on the Isle of Man, they remained there for a while, and it was there that they changed the name to C-A-L-L-O-W. But they did it for survival reasons,
Sure.
Basic
Sure.
religion.
Yes. Well, many families have had name changes for those reasons, haven't they? You know, a number of years ago, you were kind enough to give a lecture at the Uniformed Services University on your naval experience. And the one thing that sticks in my mind to this date, you said when you first went on active duty, they told you that you were preparing for a beach party. And you had visions of being a lifeguard in Hawaii. They didn't tell you that the beach happened to be named Tarawa. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Well, things can happen so fast that if you stop to consider it as a possibility, you'd reject it. And I did. I thought, this is stupid. Why are we going to do a thing like this? These poor guys are out there getting shot. You know. Well, it turned out to be a very useful maneuver, but I think I could do it better. That's always one of my flaws. But anyway, it turned out that we were sent down to Fort Pierce, Florida, and then we went to Palm Beach, and we fired the big guns of 3-inch 50s, and we fired the machine guns, and we had bayonet practice, and they formed what they called a beach battalion. And this was made up of so many men with construction workers, communications, photographers, doctors, boat people, and so forth and so on. And I do respect the brass, the higher. That's a disrespectful word probably, but I mean it in a congratulatory way. But these units had almost everything you'd need when you hit a beach. And so they trained us how to hit a beach. And Tarawa was an absolute shock. The dead were scattered everywhere. In 72 hours, there were 3,000 dead. And they were, the thing that when I stood back and looked at these people are sprawled on the beach, they were being washed by the tide. And I said to myself, we're losing this war as of now. It'll come to a armistice. There'll be a line north to south in the Pacific. Our people will not tolerate these casualties. And if we have to do it for all of these islands, as we're told, to get to Japan, it'll be a truce. But it wasn't, as you know. Iwo Jima was another example of this.
How many of those island landings did you personally?
7.
7.
Yeah, we went from Tarawa to Kwajalein to the coast of New Guinea all the way up to the Bird's Head. We went to islands in the Philippines and Iwo Jima. And when the bomb fell, most of us didn't believe it because most of these occasions turned out to be false rumors or whatever, wishful thinking. And yet we were actually training to go into Japan. The island we were going to hit, of the 3 main islands, 4 actually, had been selected. We were just practicing for that. And then the bomb fell. A couple of the invasions, the one at Hollandia in New Guinea, turned out to be a walk ashore. We surprised the Japanese troops at Hollandia at breakfast, and the men quickly found. I admire these enlisted men. I just think if you're an enlisted man and you're in a combat unit, whether you're in Europe trying to overrun Germany or in the Pacific, to think after you fought all day to put out a machine gun nest and seen your buddy hit or whatever, and then get a cup of cold coffee if you're lucky, and then know that the next day when you awake, if you're fortunate enough to get any sleep, and do it again, and Berlin is way out there, or Tokyo is way out there, and you're an enlisted man, and you've got a little pop gun in your hand, and you need a fleet of super bombers, but you get up and you do it. I have the greatest admiration for these people, and I think that the population of this country is so fortunate for some reason to be able to develop men and now women who will expose themselves to shot and shell and do it a day after day after day. I don't know how the Marines, for example, instill in these young people the spirit that drives them forward to do this.
Well, the same for you. You know, 7 landings. You watched many of your colleagues get hit.
Oh, yeah.
And yet you were willing to go back.
Well, one of my friends, we were roommates around. He was a Shenley's liquor salesman, wholesale before the war. Just by chance, there may be a little machine there that clicks out the names and numbers and the places you go. But he was a very good companion. He was a beach master. It was his job to get the trash off the beach, get the casualties out, get the supplies in and over the hill, and he did it very well. There were a lot of them who did this sort of thing. They didn't get much glory, but they certainly moved the war along.
Did you feel adequately trained for the job that you had to do?
No, but when I was in one of my I hate everything moods, which we all go through once in a while, I realized that the only training is the actual experience. Right. We had a young fellow with us who was entertained in Hollywood and very pleasant, likable guy. And he made a very serious mistake. He wanted to be part of the action. And he pleaded with the captain, his line officer, a very nice guy. And he pleaded with the skipper to make a landing. He had to be part of it. And I said, don't do this, you're crazy. You're absolutely crazy. That chance piece of metal that's flying through the air will take your head off and you won't even know it. But he did. And we hit the beach, Geronimo, and hit the beach, dig in, get down, try to be part of the earth. And he was just ahead of me, about as far as we are, and 6, 8 feet. And he fell flat. I said, he's got a hole in his head. He's dead. And I crawled up to him, and he was immobile, but he was breathing. And I rolled him over. There wasn't a mark on him, but by this time things had moved ahead a little bit. And he just was, I think, shell-shocked. I'm not sure how to define that. But he laid, there wasn't a mark on him. And he later said to me, I don't know how you prepare yourself for this. Yeah. I said, well, you just did. Yeah, but we got very fatalistic about it. We knew, and we would make up these little compositions. We're going to make the next one. If we survive this one, there'll be another one. We'll make that one. And then we'd say to each other, we'll survive the next one.
We do have your interview with Andy Dale in 1986 that complements what you've said here, the band of brothers that Jim DeWeese and George Johnson finished. But we also have your lectures, and I will send those to you. We're converting the audio-video tapes to DVD, and I'll send those to you. I think you'd enjoy looking at those and what you said. But having had those experiences, what made you stay in the Navy after World War II when everybody wanted to forget the war and get out of uniform? Why did you remain in the reserve?
It happened backwards. After I was promoted to Rear Admiral, I had the opportunity to meet many senior officers. Army, not so much Navy, Air Force, and a lot of Navy. I was doing special little jobs of no great consequence. And I developed tremendous respect for these senior officers. I thought at one time that nobody loved my country as much as I did. And not to expect too much for these 4-star, 3-star people. But being with them from time to time, I saw a 4-star admiral. He was Commander-in-Chief of the North Atlantic Fleet of NATO. He had 3 hats, 3 flags. And he turned around a destroyer that was on a diplomatic mission to Russia, and an exchange ship from Russia coming here, the State Department. And one of the seamen had been injured in the eye, and the corpsman on board didn't know what to do, and he was they were about 400 or 500 miles off Plymouth, England. And I happened to be in the seat temporarily of the admiral of the fleet, or whatever you want to call it, medical. And I said, this guy's in danger. How long will it take you? It was all done in code, of course, and to get to where we were going, about 4 days steaming. And I said, this is too much. Put the ship into Plymouth, where they have an adequate eye service. And this senior captain debated it, and I said, the reason is that there's something called sympathetic ophthalmia, in which infection in one eye can travel to the other. And he has nothing on board, not even ophthalmic ointment. And he could be blind. And he called a meeting of the staff, and he said, you know, gentlemen, and he had the wall maps around the world, this boy could be my son. Yeah. Put the ship into Plymouth. Let the State Department figure it out. Right. So these were superb people. Yeah. Now, I didn't know this when I was young. I looked upon anyone with a little gold on his cap as a potential spy, you know.
You served as a Rear Admiral for 10 years, 1968 to 1978, yeah, correct? Right. When you retired, did that leave you with a little bit of emptiness, sadness for leaving the service, or did you feel you had done your job?
Oh, no, I would have stayed on if there had been an opportunity. After all, you get your, having a star, you got your car, you got quarters, you got, I think, better food. I don't know, but I don't think I'd stayed on permanently in the regular Navy.
Yeah.
I had to get back to civilian life for lots of reasons.
Well, let's talk about your civilian life, and particularly your training. When you came back from World War II, tell us about completing your training.
Well, the doctors were kept on active duty, as you know, I think, much longer than the other officers because they had to do physicals for discharge about 10 million people. So I was doing that for some time, and then they put me in this line of several hundred men. Naked is the word I think is jaybird. I've never seen one, I can't describe one, but that was it. And they gave me a box of throat sticks and a flashlight, and we put through 1,000 men a day. When I first went on active duty 4 or 5 years ago, whenever it was, I requested assignment to a Navy hospital. After all, I'm the second best surgeon in the world, probably. They said, yes, goodbye. And I got over there in this disassembly line, and my orders came through to be transferred to the local naval hospital. And the exec of the hospital welcomed me aboard and said, I'm so glad, we do need a nose and throat man, and he's gone. So I did that for a while. But getting back into civilian activity was difficult because we suddenly were all discharged, and here were 5,000, 2,000, I don't know, young, eager guys looking for jobs. So I took a job as a research assistant, and I helped design a laboratory. Most surgeons who came back, or the chiefs, when they get back to civilian life, wanted a laboratory, a research fellow, and a dog. You know, and so I did that for about 3 years. That was how I got my PhD, and so forth.
Was there anyone who influenced you particularly at that time of your life?
Not the way some people in the war, a shelling experience. You know, if you undergo a bombardment, it teaches you to discard as quickly as possible what's trivial, and you learn a lot. I discovered a lot of the things I was doing or wanted to do were trivial. So I finally got a job and decided on vascular surgery. That was a very simple decision. You're taking a leg off somebody, young, healthy otherwise, shattered, no vascular surgery.
It was your World War II experience,
Yeah.
not specifically an individual who encouraged your thoughts along vascular surgery.
No, what encouraged me was how stupid, silly, untrained, there was no vascular surgery.
Right.
So that's what I decided to go into. And was told not to do that because there weren't enough butchers in Boston who cut the thigh every day to keep you in practice. It was very discouraging. No, and hardening of the arteries, everybody gets it, everybody dies of it, there's nothing you can do for it. That was all wrong.
Well, you know, out of all of that, one operation that you enjoyed in your professional career was carotid endarterectomy.
Yes, I did ride that horse.
Yes. Would you comment about that experience? Did it change during your professional lifetime?
It's a terrible thing to see a human being, animal, be suddenly in a stroke of the clock, be converted to a helpless, sometimes speechless or sightless organism. And it's equally heartrending to see the wife, the spouse, or the children see this wonderful person they knew now be converted to someone they can't even talk to. And the first 12 carotids I did died or had a second stroke.
Do you remember what year that was?
Yes, it was 54. And I thought, here we are with these great medical schools and these geniuses and doing wonderful things, and we can't do a damn thing, excuse me, for these people who so desperately need help. There isn't, and I argued with a neurology chief one time. I said, you people are observers, you're not physicians. You have no treatment for a stroke. There is none. And you should be doing something to see if we can create some. Well, I did 12, and they all had more severe strokes or died, and I was about ready to give it up. And a young X-ray fellow staff man from Texas. He was a radiologist, did our angiogram, and he said, "Oh, you've got to keep going." And suddenly there was a success. But the neurologist still wouldn't send patients, the wise probably. And so I cultivated physicians on the periphery, and they all came in. They wanted to see the patients, and of course I said, "Go right ahead." And I discovered that the fault was not with the operation, the fault was with me. I could not select those patients. I had to learn how to select. I was operating on all comers, and that was a mistake. Stupid, but you do what you have to do to get started.
Thinking about the manuscripts that you wrote about your experience, is there any one that stands out in your memory that you think is important? You did write a book.
Yes, I did. I wrote a book, not because I wanted to write a book so much, but because people were doing carotid endarterectomies and really did not know how to do them. And I had learned, and there's a French surgeon, Arnoulf, you may surely, Georges Arnoulf from France, said he couldn't do this operation. It was like training young men in World War II to be pilots. A certain number had to die before they refined the flying techniques. And he said, and I'm not going to go through the same thing with carotids. But we learned to select the patients, and then we went through, I'm not sure how many, 100 or 200 or something like that, and no further strokes, and no deaths, at least in the time period we observed. And so I wrote a book about how I do it, and you don't have to make the same mistakes I made. That's how that happened.
Did it go through additional editions of the
No.
book?
It was one of my numerous failures in the literary world. It sold a few copies, but along came the balloon and thrombo, and it's a better procedure than the open surgery.
Right. Oh, times have changed, haven't they? That's, that's
Well,
for sure.
Is
Is there any other vascular procedure that you remember as being an enjoyable procedure, rewarding professionally for you?
Yes, but not when you realize the results. That was lumbosympathectomy. We were doing those as if we were peeling potatoes, and some of the potatoes were kind of iffy. And we know now that that's a very limited benefit, but I must have done 1,000 of them thinking egoistically that this was going to help.
Along with your clinical work and the fact that you had a PhD and had a research background, you've maintained a lifelong interest in research. Would you tell us a little bit about that? And I think to remind you, in your presidential address to the Society for Vascular Surgery, you did make a plea to support research. Would you expand on that a little bit, please?
Well, some of the credit for my getting into research belongs to a very, very handsome woman whom I pursued vigorously, and I'm happy to say she's here with us today as my wife. She was a basic scientist. She had the Order of the British Empire from the Queen for her research in biology, the cellular biology. And she showed me things that I had never seen before. Electron microscope blown up 100,000 times instead of just 50 times. And you could see the little caveoli on the membrane. But more than that, I went to an American Heart meeting in Miami where she lived and worked, and went to a nighttime meeting evening, and this creature came in a black, sleeveless, simple, basic black dress and rope with pearls, and I can see it now. Page Boy Bob, and I said, God, I don't know what she said, but I said, this woman is something. She gave a lecture. And I pursued her, and I discovered that the indirect approach is best. So I'd been invited to a lab to give a lecture, and I'd invited her to mine to give a lecture. That was supposed to be the end of it, but I decided it was not. So I got these big pound bars of chocolate. I knew the chocolate would be gone. And I sent them I didn't send them to her, I sent them to her lab staff. And so when I was invited down there, this is the cupidity in me. I'm not this nice guy you may think. Anyway, when I got down there, I got this big welcome from these 15, 20 people in her lab, and so forth and so on.
You did maintain your interest long after you retired from your clinical activities. You still continued to contribute in the laboratories.
Yes. If you're fortunate in life, someone may come along and tell you, or you may discover it yourself, that learning is fun. It almost doesn't matter whether it's Persian, Sanskrit, or pottery in Greece, but the learning can be fun. You make a little effort, and suddenly you find yourself on the street where she lives, and you know something, and it's a pleasant feeling. And if you can know that something in an area that's of use, potential use, then you've made a contribution just there.
Well, I think you can be very proud to know that people like Jimmy Yao and many others still refer back to your presidential address in 1986 to the Society for Vascular Surgery, because you made some very important points about research and about the dedication that's necessary.
Well, an artery is not just a tube. It's a living creature. It's made up of little cells, and they have their lives, and they marry with other cells, and they put out little enzymes. And the answer is at that time, was in the microscope. And when you also consider it, when we as surgeons put clamps on an artery and put a knife to it and clean it out, that's pretty rough treatment.
Sure.
And we're lucky that it smooths itself over. And I thought that's where the problems are.
During your presidency to the Society for Vascular Surgery, Lifeline was established, and you and Cal Ernst, among others, had a lot to do with that. In addition to being a clinician, a researcher, a military man, you're also an economist, it seems. You know something about finances, and you taught doctors who didn't know anything about 5013C type of thing. Would you comment on Lifeline a little bit, please?
The life of any society, and many, many other things, is in the young people who are in it. And young people have expenses just as old people do. And I always thought that the ordinary young person wants to do something more, whatever it is he or she is doing. And research is an easy avenue to do something more, if you can get funding. Now, the ideas aren't coming from people like me. They're coming from the 25, 30, 35-year-olds. And these are the people who are tomorrow's people, who are going to be making decisions, and we should support them. And you can't support a research effort of any importance on a $5,000 grant, nor can you support it on a $50,000 one-year grant. And it's got to be continuing, because this young person is sacrificing an income stream if he were to go into clinical practice. And I just thought that with all the money that's flowing around, and we had a lot of cash in this country at one time, we better do something about it. That was the origin of that.
Yeah. We're doing this for the Society for Vascular Surgery, but you are also extremely involved with the International Society for Cardiovascular Surgery, the North American chapter, the worldwide organization. Would you comment about your years of leadership in that area?
Well, it was very fortunate. I was also asked to be an official, actually president of something called the International Cardiovascular Society. And I decided that if I were going to be doing something like that, I better know some of these people. So I took about 2 months off and traveled at my own expense to various centers where I got myself invited. And I realized that America is not the center of the universe in vascular surgery. Their history went back much longer than the Americans. And I made many friends there. And I thought, this is a great treasure house. And we in America don't even know the names of many of these people. And I just thought that, after all, blood vessels are everywhere. And we think we know everything there is to know about it. But I can show you people like Sid Dos Santos, who started a whole new field of surgery. You don't even know his name. And so, Dos Santos,
John Kuhnlin.
yeah, and so forth.
Yeah. Rene Lariche.
Yes, yes.
That one famous photograph from the mid-30s that Dr. DeBakey had all of them,
yes,
including Dr. DeBakey with Dr. Lariche in
That's
Strasbourg.
Right. That's right.
Very, very important photograph for history.
Exactly.
Well, this is why we appreciate your comments. I know it's difficult to pick out any individuals, but you mentioned George Arnouf earlier. Is there anybody on the international scene that you really enjoyed a long exchange with?
Well, at one time it was, he was president of the Royal Society of Surgeons. He retired to the Channel Islands, and he was a vascular surgeon. He wrote a very thin, slim book, and I can't think of his name.
Norman Browse?
Yes, thank you. And I've been
I haven't seen him for a few years. He's been on the Channel Island, like you said.
Well, I gave a talk over there in France once on the ligation of the vena cava to prevent pulmonary emboli and death. And he asked me to come over, and I gave this talk. And I did some prophylactically, maybe 10 or 12 patients prophylactically, who I thought were at very high risk of a clot. And they did not have a clot, but they were scheduled to have one, let's say. And I wrote a paper about that. And he called it a barbaric operation, and thank God it hasn't crossed the Atlantic. A year later, I'm in London and giving a talk. But at that time, I was the moderator, which he had been in the meeting previously, and he gave a talk. And then came time for me as a moderator, and I said, I'm so grateful for having such wonderful relatives in medicine and surgery.
One delightful afternoon I remember was on the island of Corfu.
Oh, yeah.
It was the first Mediterranean, whatever it was, that Takis Balas organized, and we went to a monastery called Paleokastritsis, and it was one of the most idyllic scenes, I think, I ever have seen, overlooking the Ionian Sea at sunset and that type of thing. You may remember that.
Oh,
just
yes.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Is there any place in the world that really stands out in your mind from those types of exchanges?
Yes, Cape Town, the first heart transplant, and the seminar down there. And I got there really, I was asked to go and I didn't want to go. I thought apartheid was dreadful. We'd somewhat solved part of our problem in this country and so forth. So I kept refusing. And another person from the States kept refusing. But it happened that the guy who called us said, well, that's too bad. We're doing all we can to get you here, but we were going to take the faculty on safari. And I said, when? And she said, when? I didn't know any of this at the time, so we went down there. And the meeting, the day before the meeting, they offered to take us on a little tour, and I said, okay, I want to go down and stand in the water at the end of the continent, Indian Ocean here and the Atlantic Ocean there, and a picture taken. You know, we got there, and there was a woman down there doing that very thing with a skirt yanked up above her knees. And I said, who was that? It turned out to be the woman you met today, my wife. And that scene of her, like that, I said, this is twice this has happened. I've got to put an end to it. So I married her, and she married me.
Oh, that's great. Well, you've had many awards, much recognition. Probably one of the most outstanding was the award from Tufts University, where you contributed for so many years in so many different capacities. Tell us about your years at Tufts.
I was very annoyed at Tufts. I loved it. It got me into Harvard. But it was a little backwater college, tree-lined streets, and, you know, thumbed through Shakespeare. And when I made the trusteeship, I didn't intend to be chairman of the board. That's too much work. I didn't have time for it. But I got to be chairman of the board. And it happened, we just had a president at that time, John Mayer, who felt the same way. He was out of Harvard in France. And we and a third person who was a fundraiser decided we were going to shake the place up. And we did. And it's a first-rate university now. And I'm very proud of my part in that. And I learned a technique. I have, a board of trustees, and they're all successful people. They all had their agendas and so forth and so on. So I created a executive management committee, a businessman, a lawyer, and a very loyal alumnus, and a very wealthy man. And we would meet once a month, whereas the board would meet 2 or 3 times a year. And I told him my plan. I said, I think we've got to shake up this place. It's a great place, but it can be so much better. And it needs money, and it needs a purpose. And so they agreed, and I developed this technique, which I think is totally at odds with custom. And I would propose a motion that we'd have discussed it, and they'd agree to it. We're going to put up a new chemistry building. We're going to give scholarships to everybody with limited income. And we would pass this subject to ratification of the full board. So at the full board meeting, I sent out the brochures. I had a full-time secretary to help with this, of course. And we'd send this out. And the board would say, well, we haven't had a discussion. Well, you have had a discussion. Granted, it's limited. But if you want to join this management committee and meet with us once a month, and we'll go all day long, we are welcome. And that worked. This ratification, subject to ratification, was the ointment that soothed the wound. And I enjoyed doing this, but I was also glad to give it up. It wasn't my main interest. I had no intention of being a trustee, or certainly not chairman of the board. But it happens.
It's probably not appropriate to ask you if you have any one experience that you think about as being the most positive or the most productive, because you had different eras of life where you had those job satisfactions. But is there anything that stands out in your thinking?
I was a junior intern at the Boston City Hospital. This was I don't know, 30, when did I graduate? 38, 39. Somewhere in 1938, 39. And we would have the usual jungle warfare on the streets of any metropolitan city, and on the weekend, liquor and so forth, and knives. So we had the Knife and Gun Club in Boston. And these people would come in at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning. They'd be half drunk or not, didn't much matter. And being the junior man on the service, that was your private patient. And this fellow came in, and he had a slash in the wrist. He cut up almost all his tendons and nerves. And that was my assignment. And the nurses in the OR knew this sort of thing, so they got out the textbook of anatomy and opened it up to the pictures on the wrist. So you could identify all of these things. And then said to me, it will help you if you put a tag on them, just a black thread, so you can find it again, and a white thread on these. But this sort of thing happened again and again. I was also the junior intern, and a young boy, 12 or so, was brought in with severe osteomyelitis, and the bone was exposed. And we had no penicillin. This was sulfanilamide powder, and that was it. And I was admitting him, and at 4 o'clock we'd have grand rounds, and the super chief would make rounds, and that was your lifeline. And she looked over my shoulder and said, do you want to impress your resident? Well, yes. So she dictated about 12 orders. I wrote them all out, and we put them on the record. 4 o'clock comes, the team comes by, the chief asks for the board, and he looks at it, and he keeps silent as he's doing it. So he turned to the nurse. He didn't turn to me. He wasn't no dummy. He said, "That's very good. You, yeah. You wrote these orders, right?" "Yes, right. I wrote them, but I didn't." He said, "Well, they're okay." And that was a minor triumph, because I thought I probably was going to be cashiered the next day. Life is full of these surprises.
Well, this is the 21st century. If you had it to do all over again, would you have the same enthusiasm you had at that period of your life?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Do you have any advice for young people today? You've already emphasized that the young people are our future.
You know, John Wayne said something. He was asked about what is courage. And courage is a lot of things, and you can define it in many ways. Basically, he said, well, you get this situation, and you know it's rough, and it's going to be rougher, and what do? You saddle up and you ride out. And I think that you do that most of the time, and most of the time, I think, you're surprised that at the end you're still alive and everything's okay, because it just works out that way. I'd do it all over again. I'd go back to medical school tomorrow, and I'd be a much better doctor. And the medical school might get a little shaken up some, but...
Now that so much of vascular intervention is catheter-based, and so many of the procedures that you and I learned to do and did for so many years aren't even done today.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about fellowship training, how we can manage?
I don't know, this is really a tough one, but it's a very, very important one. It's like a black problem at one time in this country. We're getting it under control. It was like a Jewish problem before that. I remember in Boston, the stores, when I help wanted, Irish need not apply. All of this stuff has been going on for generations, centuries. But we managed to control them, overcome them. We don't have riots in the street, not yet, where we could have. And I would put my money, this goes for the society, and I don't have a plan as to how to do it, but the objective is to turn all that you possibly can over to young people. They'll make mistakes, but heaven's sakes, look at the mistakes I made, and didn't know I was making mistakes, all in good faith. I would convert I think President Obama has done a splendid job with what he had to work with. I'm not sure that he's the man to re-elect, but nevertheless, you have to give credit where credit is due. My great-grandfather invented the Republican Party. He's not. So that's the way it is. And many times you're a Catholic because you're born in a Catholic family. Then you make the best of it. But you usually do a very good job. I would turn as much as I possibly could over to young people. And how do you do it? I think you could model it after our society in general, a mentor system. If some young person, preferably a woman at this point, I don't need to go into details, I think I don't, to be mentored by someone like you, or mentored by someone like Jimmy Yao, or any number of people out there. I think the Vascular Society, SVS, is going to continue. I don't think the balloonists are going to put us out of business. We may change what we're doing. We're making widgets today, but in the war we may convert to guns and so on. But there's a huge amount of talent in the SVS, and the talent, if I can be so immodest, has many facets. It's doing lots of things. If you ask one of our prominent members, you probably come up with a list of things that he's doing beyond and above the vascular art. The secret is to find something bigger than yourself and fasten onto it. That's like the South Pacific song, when you find your true love, never let it go. And vascular society is loaded with talent.
Do you think the decision in 2003 to join the ISCVS and the SVS was a good decision?
I think the basis was proper. The idea, I think, was to increase the exposure of people who were doing, whether they could do it well or not, to how it should be done. If the desire at the time was to maintain, there's a wonderful book called In Defense of Elitism, and some much useful information in there. But if you carry it too far, you begin to destroy parts of what you're trying to say.
Right.
I would get as many young people in as possible. As far as the other society is concerned, we did it in the International Society, and I don't want to identify this too precisely because the situation has changed. But there were a lot of people doing what they called vascular surgery, which is absolutely reprehensible. And John Oxner, who knew this particular group, and I sat down one day in the membership list and X'd a lot of names and cleaned it up to some extent. So I don't think it was, in the long haul, a major mistake. But you have to have a barrel full of patience to do something like this.
With the 05 program for vascular fellowship starting in 2006, the number of programs now is over 40 in the United States. There's still a mixed emotion about this.
Sure.
And do you have any thoughts about medical students going directly into vascular, whatever we want to call it, interventions?
I would encourage it as much as I could, and I would downplay the hostility, you know. Take an extreme example. Look what France and Britain did to Germany after World War I. They made the punishment for the war, the reparation payments,
Right.
just so dreadful that another war was inevitable.
Right.
They had to do it for survival. Hitler was created by the peace treaty
Sure.
of anti-communists,
Right.
who they were afraid of. I think if you can keep people talking, keep the donuts and coffee coming in, and get young people in there. My daughter here is a very thoughtful person, and she brings me up short sometimes when I say something, and I'm not accustomed to people saying no, but she says no, and yet she usually is right. I think you have to keep people talking.
You know, Allan, you've had a very, very productive life, very balanced life. Some people would ask, do you have any hobbies outside of medicine?
Hobbies?
How would you respond to that?
I used to love to ski, but
That's something outside of medicine.
yeah, well, sometimes it gets you into it.
But you know, as you've alluded to several times, we're privileged people because we're students forever, and we get satisfaction out of being physicians.
I'm writing books. I've written 2 books. They've both been colossal failures. I've written the 3rd book, my war experiences. I've been telling the story of war from the point of view of a guy who has to carry a gun and gets shot at. It's not about, war is such, that's my second hobby. I think war is so destructive and people are so blind. There's a saying, and I don't know who gets the credit. If you don't know much about war, you'd better learn pretty quickly, because sooner or later you'll be involved. And so my intellectual hobby is, what can we do to prevent or delay or lessen war? We destroy so much. But I haven't found a formula. People read a chapter and they say, gee, this is great. And so I write 3 or 4 chapters and the editors give it the deep 6.
Persistence pays off, as you know, and that's what it's going to take.
True. true.
Well, we really appreciate all of your comments and suggestions. To sort of wrap this up, is there anything that we've left out that you would like to include?
I think you better blue pencil a lot of what I said. But I have learned some things are important, and a lot of things that used to worry me aren't that important at all. I do want to say one thing. I think the SBS is wonderful. It should continue. It should strive to continue. It may not know where it should go or where it wants to go, but there's a collection, a body of people here. You could turn it into a mini United Nations if you want to. You could change it from plowshares to guns or whatever you want. But this organization should be fostered, every bit of it.
Well, I think you've left a legacy, and I think you can be very proud of that, and I think we can both be satisfied that there are many young people involved and that the future of the Society for Vascular Surgery is very positive. So
you're one of the primary reasons. Yes, you are.
Allan, you've said so many things that are important to our heritage, our legacy, on behalf of the Society for Vascular Surgery, and particularly from my standpoint, 45 years of friendship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks the committee for me.